Hey guys, tonight we begin with ancient hospitals, places that make modern emergency rooms look like luxury spas. Here's something that'll make you appreciate your next doctor's visit. Ancient hospitals had a higher mortality rate than actual battlefields, and that's including the ones where people were actively trying to kill each other. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease tonight's journey together into the wonderfully terrifying world of ancient medical care. Let's start with the biggest misconception about ancient hospitals. Most people imagine them as primitive but well-meaning places where dedicated healers did their best with limited resources, kind of like a medieval version of Doctors Without Borders. In reality, ancient hospitals were more like combination torture chambers, religious revival meetings, and amateur chemistry labs run by people who thought demons caused headaches. Think of it like this. Imagine if your local hospital was staffed entirely by people who learned medicine from YouTube videos. But YouTube was just a guy named Marcus who once saw someone else treat a fever. This wasn't Florence Nightingale gently tending to the wounded by lamplight. It was more like a horror movie where the monsters wear togas and carry medical instruments that look suspiciously like farming tools. The ancient world was a place where evidence-based medicine meant, well, it worked on my cousin's goat. Ancient civilizations like Greece, Rome, and Egypt weren't desanitized. Noble societies you see in movies. They were sweaty, smelly, superstitious places where the average person had about as much understanding of germs as a toddler has of quantum physics. The medical establishment controlled healing through a delightful combination of religious ritual, folk wisdom passed down through generations of people who died at 30, and what can only be described as enthusiastic guessing. If you thought ancient doctors were wise, bearded scholars carefully studying the human body, think again. Most of them were essentially witch doctors with better marketing, operating in societies where washing your hands was considered optional and bleeding patience was considered therapeutic. The temples and early hospitals weren't sterile centers of learning. They were often cramped, poorly ventilated buildings where sick people were packed together like sardines, creating what modern epidemiologists would recognize as perfect disease incubators. The priestly classes who ran many of these institutions believed illness was divine punishment, which meant their treatment plans often involved more praying than actual medicine. Meet Asclepius, the Greek god of medicine, whose temple served as the ancient world's first hospitals. Now, you might think having an actual deity running your healthcare system would be pretty reassuring. But Asclepius had some interesting treatment methods that would make modern doctors file malpractice suits from beyond the grave. Patients would sleep in the temple overnight, hoping the god would visit them in dreams and reveal a cure. Sounds peaceful, right? Wrong. The temples were full of sacred snakes that would slither over sleeping patients, because apparently nothing says healing like reptiles crawling on sick people in the dark. One patient, according to records, dreamed that Asclepius told him to eat nothing but garlic for a month to cure his stomach problems. Spoiler alert, he died, but hey, at least he died with very flavorful breath. Another favorite Asclepian treatment involved temple prostitutes, because the Greeks believed sexual activity could cure certain ailments. Imagine explaining that to your insurance company today. And if you think that's bizarre, wait until you hear about the Roman military hospitals, where wounded soldiers were treated by medics whose previous experience was mostly, "I once helped birth a calf." This wasn't just about ineffective medicine. It was about a fundamental misunderstanding of how bodies, disease, and healing actually work. When your entire medical system is based on the idea that illness is caused by angry gods, imbalanced humors, or evil spirits, you're not exactly setting yourself up for success. Millions of people suffered and died from treatable conditions because their doctors thought bloodletting would balance their temperament, or that drilling holes in their skulls would release demons. Women died in childbirth, not just from complications, but from doctors who didn't understand basic hygiene. Soldiers survived brutal battles only to die from infections in military hospitals where the surgeons used the same unwashed tools on dozens of patients. This was a world where going to the hospital often meant trading one problem for several worse ones, where the cure was frequently deadlier than the disease. But the divine snake massage therapy of Asclepian temples was just the beginning. The Romans, never ones to be outdone in anything, took ancient medicine to new heights of terrifying creativity. Let me tell you about their military hospitals, where medical innovation met Roman efficiency in the most horrifying ways possible. Roman military hospitals, or valetudinaria, as they pretentiously called them, represent what happens when you combine Roman organizational efficiency with ancient medical knowledge, which is to say, very organized incompetence, unlike the common assumption that Roman military medicine was advanced for its time. The reality was more like a factory assembly line for converting wounded soldiers into dead soldiers, just with extra steps and significantly more paperwork. These weren't the clean, efficient field hospitals you see in war movies. They were more like medieval McDonald's restaurants, but instead of burgers, they were mass-producing amputations. And instead of, "Would you like fries with that?" it was, "Would you like your legs sawed off with or without wine?" The Roman military medical system developed out of sheer necessity. When you're constantly conquering new territories and your soldiers keep inconveniently getting injured, you need some kind of system to patch them up and send them back to the front lines. The Romans, being Romans, approached this with their typical can-do attitude and complete ignorance of basic medical science. They built the first standardized military hospitals around 100 CE, complete with wards, surgical rooms, and what they optimistically called recovery areas. These facilities were marvels of Roman engineering, perfectly designed buildings. That would have been fantastic hospitals if only the people inside them had any idea what they were doing. The Roman military medics, called medici, were trained through a rigorous system of apprenticeship, which sounds impressive until you realize they were apprenticed to other people who also didn't know what they were doing. It was like a pyramid scheme, but instead of selling essential oils, they were selling medical treatments that were essentially just elaborate ways to die. The Medici learned their trade by watching experienced practitioners memorizing treatments from military manuals and developing what they called battlefield intuition, which was really just a fancy way of saying making it up as you go along while people are screaming. Take the case of Marcus Flavius, a Roman legionnaire who took an arrow to the shoulder during a campaign in Germania. In a modern emergency room, this would be a straightforward procedure. Clean the wound, remove the arrow, stitch it up, antibiotics, done. But Marcus had the misfortune of being injured in 85 CE, so his treatment was considerably more creative. First, the medicus examined the wound by poking it with his finger. The same finger he'd just used to examine 3 other patients' various bodily fluids. Hygiene wasn't exactly a priority. The Romans believed that if you were tough enough to be a soldier, you were tough enough to handle a little cross-contamination. The medicus determined that the arrow had to come out, which was correct, but his method involved having 4 soldiers hold Marcus down while he yanked on the arrow with a pair of pliers designed for pulling nails out of wood. When that didn't work, he decided to push the arrow all the way through Marcus's shoulder and out the other side, because apparently in for a penny, in for a pound was ancient medical wisdom. After creating what was essentially a second wound, the medicus cleaned both holes by pouring wine into them. Not medical wine, just regular wine that someone had been drinking. The theory was that wine had mystical cleansing properties, which it doesn't, but it did make Marcus drunk enough to stop screaming, so the medicus considered it a success. Then came the really fun part, cauterization. Using a red-hot iron, the medicus sealed both wounds, creating scar tissue that would plague Marcus for the rest of his considerably shortened life. But wait, there's more. The medicus wasn't satisfied with just treating the physical wound. Roman military medicine was big on treating the whole person, which meant addressing what they believed were the spiritual and humoral imbalances that had made Marcus susceptible to injury in the first place. This involved bloodletting, because clearly what a man who just lost a significant amount of blood needed was to lose more blood. They opened a vein in Marcus's arm and let him bleed into a bowl until he passed out, which they interpreted as a sign that his humors were rebalancing. Another documented case involves a Roman centurion named Gaius who suffered a head injury during a siege. The military manual recommended trepanation, drilling a hole in the skull to release pressure and evil spirits. The medicus, working by candlelight in a tent filled with other wounded soldiers, used what was essentially a carpentry drill to bore a hole in Gaius's head. Amazingly, Gaius survived the procedure, though he was never quite the same afterwards. The medicus attributed this personality change to successfully releasing the evil spirits, rather than, drilling a hole in someone's brain. The surgical instruments used in these hospitals were impressive pieces of Roman metalwork, beautifully crafted tools that looked very professional. Unfortunately, they were used by people who thought infection was caused by bad air and that you could diagnose internal injuries by examining a patient's urine color. Imagine giving a perfectly good set of surgical instruments to someone whose medical training consisted of watch this guy do it a few times, then wing it. Roman military surgeons performed amputations with saws designed for cutting wood, conducted eye surgery with needles meant for sewing leather, and removed arrows with tools that were essentially fancy pliers. But it wasn't that simple. It never is with the Romans. While Roman military medicine was spectacularly incompetent by modern standards, it was actually pretty advanced for its time, which tells you something about just how terrible ancient medicine generally was. The Romans did understand some things correctly. They knew that keeping wounds cleanish was important, even if their definition of clean was rinse it with wine and hope for the best. They recognized that certain herbs had medicinal properties, though they also believed that the herbs had to be picked at specific times of day while reciting prayers to be effective. The contradiction at the heart of Roman military medicine was that they were simultaneously incredibly systematic and completely wrong about almost everything. They had detailed medical manuals that precisely described procedures that were based on fundamentally flawed understanding of human anatomy. They built beautiful, well-organized hospitals staffed by people who thought the heart was primarily responsible for thinking, and the brain was just there to cool the blood. Roman medici were actually quite skilled. Surgeons by ancient standards, they could amputate limbs, remove cataracts, and perform basic operations with remarkable success rates. The problem was that their success was largely accidental. They didn't understand why certain procedures worked, so they couldn't consistently replicate their successes. A medicus might successfully treat 10 soldiers with similar wounds using the same method, then kill the 11th patient because he decided to add an extra step he thought would be helpful. The Romans also had a bizarre relationship with pain management. They understood that opium could reduce pain, but they believed that suffering was character building, so pain relief was often reserved for the most severe cases. Soldiers were expected to endure minor surgeries while fully conscious, not because anesthesia wasn't available, but because crying during medical procedures was considered unmanly. This led to the paradox of Roman military medicine. They had some of the most advanced surgical techniques in the ancient world, but they performed them on fully conscious patients who were biting down on leather straps and probably questioning their life choices. The result was a military medical system that was both impressively organized and horrifyingly deadly. Roman military hospitals had mortality rates that would make modern emergency rooms shut down permanently. Studies of ancient Roman military cemeteries suggest that wounded soldiers were about as likely to die in the hospital as they were on the battlefield, which raises the question of why they bothered with hospitals at all. The soldiers themselves developed a gallows humor about military medicine that would be familiar to anyone who's ever dealt with military healthcare. Roman graffiti from military camps includes jokes about Medici, complaints about treatment, and what can only be described as ancient medical malpractice reviews. One piece of graffiti from a camp in Britain reads, "Marcus, the medicus couldn't heal a hangnail," while another says, "If you want to die quickly, get sick slowly." Roman military commanders had mixed feelings about their medical corps. On one hand, they recognized that having some kind of medical support was better than having none at all. Soldiers who believed they might survive their wounds fought more bravely than those who assumed injury meant certain death. On the other hand, commanders frequently complained about the costs of maintaining hospitals and the number of soldiers who seemed to get sicker rather than better under medical care. The broader Roman society viewed military medicine with a combination of pride and horror. Romans were proud of their systematic approach to military healthcare. No other ancient civilization had anything comparable to their network of military hospitals. But families dreaded receiving news that their sons had been sent to a military hospital, because everyone knew someone who had gone in with a minor wound and come out in a box. Interestingly, the high mortality rates in Roman military hospitals led to some of the first documented cases of medical skepticism in the ancient world. Some soldiers began refusing treatment for minor wounds, preferring to take their chances with natural healing rather than Roman military medicine. This created a secondary problem. Soldiers who were genuinely sick or injured would sometimes hide their conditions to avoid being sent to the hospital, leading to more serious complications later. The Roman military medical system also had unintended social consequences. Because military medici were often freed slaves or lower-class citizens, and because their success rates were so poor, the profession of medicine gained a reputation as something practiced by social outcasts and charlatans. This perception would persist for centuries, contributing to the low status of physicians in medieval Europe. Meanwhile, while Roman soldiers were learning to fear their own medici more than enemy weapons, civilian medicine in the ancient world was developing along completely different lines. Roman military hospitals might have been organized disasters, but they were at least organized. Civilian medicine, on the other hand, was pure chaos, a wild west of competing medical theories, religious healing, folk remedies, and outright quackery. That made military medicine look downright scientific by comparison. If you thought Roman military surgeons were bad, wait until you meet the civilian doctors, who thought they could cure everything from cancer to depression using nothing but herbs, prayers, and an unshakable confidence in their own ignorance. These were the people who gave us medical classics like "drink your own urine for health" and "rub goose fat on everything." They operated in a medical marketplace where anyone could call themselves a doctor, where medical licenses didn't exist, and where the most successful practitioners were often the best salesmen rather than the best healers. The contrast between military and civilian medicine in the ancient world reveals something fascinating about how different approaches to the same fundamental ignorance could produce vastly different results. While military medicine was wrong but systematic, civilian medicine was wrong and completely anarchic, creating a medical landscape that would have been hilarious if it weren't so deadly. If Roman military medicine was organized in competence, then civilian medicine in the ancient world was pure, unadulterated chaos with a medical degree from the University of Making Things Up. While military medici at least had standardized procedures for killing their patients, civilian doctors were free-range quacks operating in a medical Wild West, where literally anyone could hang out a shingle and start prescribing remedies that range from mildly useless to spectacularly lethal. Picture this. You're living in ancient Rome, Athens, or Alexandria, and you wake up with a headache. Your options for treatment include the temple priest, who thinks your pain is divine punishment, the street doctor who insists that bleeding you will balance your humors, the herbalist who wants to stuff exotic plants up your nose, the astrologer physician who needs to check your birth chart before prescribing anything, and the guy who claims he learned medicine from a dream, but is really just selling colored water at premium prices. It's like having WebMD. The WebMD was written by people who thought the liver was responsible for courage and that you could diagnose pregnancy by making women urinate on barley seeds. This medical marketplace thrived precisely because there was no regulation, no licensing, and no real understanding of what actually worked. Success in civilian medicine depended less on medical knowledge and more on showmanship, marketing skills, and the ability to confidently explain why your failures were actually the patient's fault. The most successful ancient doctors weren't necessarily the most knowledgeable. They were the most convincing, the most charismatic, and often the most expensive, because humans have always had this weird tendency to assume that costly treatments must be better treatments. The really fascinating part is that this chaotic system actually produced some genuine medical advances, but purely by accident. With hundreds of different practitioners trying thousands of different treatments, occasionally someone would stumble onto something that actually worked. The problem was that they usually had no idea why it worked, so they develop elaborate theories to explain their success that were completely wrong but sounded very impressive to people who didn't know any better. Consider the case of the Solace of Trails, a first-century physician who might be the ancient world's greatest medical con artist. The Solace claimed he had revolutionized medicine by developing a system that could cure any disease in exactly 3 days, no more, no less. His method involved a combination of purging, bloodletting, and what he called pneumatic therapy, which was basically just telling patients to breathe differently while he waved his hands around mysteriously. The Solace set up practice in Rome and immediately began marketing himself as the greatest physician who had ever lived. He literally had inscriptions carved on his house, declaring himself superior to all previous doctors, which is like putting up a billboard that says, "World's most humble person." His 3-day cure system became wildly popular among wealthy Romans, partly because it was expensive, and partly because rich people love the idea that their problems can be solved quickly if they just pay enough money. The genius of the Solace's system was that it was designed to be unfalsifiable. If a patient recovered in 3 days, obviously the treatment worked. If they died, well, they must have waited too long to seek treatment, or they didn't follow the instructions properly, or they had some rare condition that required a different approach that the Solace just happened to have developed. If they got worse, it was because the disease was fighting back, which meant they needed more treatment. The Solace had created the perfect scam, a medical system where every possible outcome proved he was right. Another fascinating character was Cyrannus of Ephesus, who specialized in gynecology and obstetrics, which in the ancient world meant he was responsible for most of the creative ways women could die during childbirth. Cyrannus wrote detailed treatises on women's health that were considered authoritative for centuries, despite being based on fundamental misunderstandings of female anatomy. He believed that women's wombs could wander around inside their bodies, like lost tourists, causing various ailments depending on where the womb decided to vacation that week. Cyrannus's treatments for wandering womb syndrome included fumigating women's vaginas with burning herbs to coax the womb back into position, tying tight bands around women's bodies to physically prevent womb migration, and prescribing specific sexual positions that he claimed would keep wombs properly anchored. One of his case studies describes treating a woman whose womb had allegedly traveled up to her chest, causing breathing problems. His solution was to hang the woman upside down and shake her vigorously until the womb fell back into place. Amazingly, this particular patient survived, which Soranus took as proof that his theory was correct. Then there was Galen, probably the most famous physician of the ancient world, who combined genuine medical insights with spectacular wrongness in equal measure. Galen performed public dissections and surgical demonstrations that were part medical procedure, part theatrical performance. He would invite wealthy patrons to watch him operate on gladiators, providing running commentary on what he was doing and why, like an ancient medical cooking show, but with more screaming. Galen's most famous public demonstration involved a pig that he had paralyzed by cutting specific nerves, then dramatically cured by reconnecting them. The crowd was amazed. Galen's reputation soared, and rich Romans lined up to pay enormous fees for his services. What the audience didn't know was that Galen had spent months practicing this exact procedure on dozens of pigs, most of which had died horribly until he finally got it right once. But that one success was enough to convince everyone that he was a miracle worker. The really tragic part is that some civilian doctors were actually trying to practice good medicine within the constraints of ancient knowledge. There were physicians who carefully observed their patients, kept detailed records of treatments and outcomes, and genuinely tried to help people. But they were competing in a marketplace where the flashiest, most confident practitioners got the most business regardless of their actual success rates. A doctor who honestly admitted the limits of his knowledge and recommended conservative treatment was at a severe disadvantage compared to someone who promised miraculous cures and blamed failures on the patient's lack of faith. This wasn't isolated to just a few bad doctors. The entire system of ancient civilian medicine was structured to reward confidence over competence. The pattern repeated across the entire Mediterranean world. The most successful medical practitioners were invariably the best salesmen, regardless of whether their treatments actually worked. The economic incentives were completely backwards. Doctors who kept patients sick longer made more money, while doctors who actually cured people quickly lost potential revenue. This led to treatment regimens that were deliberately prolonged and complicated, not because they were more effective, but because they were more profitable. A simple herbal remedy that cured someone in a day couldn't compete economically with a complex treatment system that required months of expensive consultations, exotic ingredients, and elaborate procedures. Social status also played a huge role in medical success. Wealthy, well-connected doctors attracted wealthy patients, regardless of their medical skills. Poor doctors, even if they were more competent, were stuck treating poor patients who couldn't afford to pay much and whose deaths wouldn't damage the doctor's reputation among influential people. This created a medical aristocracy where social class was more important than medical knowledge. The pattern extended to medical education, such as it was. Aspiring doctors learned by apprenticing themselves to successful practitioners, which meant they learned to replicate success rather than understand medicine. Students were taught to copy their master's techniques, mannerisms, and even their mistakes, creating medical dynasties where wrong ideas were passed down through generations like family heirlooms. Religious and philosophical beliefs also shaped medical practice in predictable ways. Doctors who aligned their treatments with popular religious or philosophical movements attracted followers who valued ideological purity over medical effectiveness. Stoic physicians prescribed treatments that emphasized enduring suffering, Epicurean. Doctors recommended pleasure-based therapies, and religious healers integrated prayer and ritual into every aspect of treatment. Patients chose doctors based on their philosophical compatibility rather than their track record of actually helping people. The effects were catastrophic and far-reaching. Millions of people suffered and died from treatable conditions because the medical system rewarded showmanship over substance. Women died in childbirth from interventions that made delivery more dangerous, not safer. Children died from diseases that could have been managed with simple supportive care, but instead were treated with procedures that weakened them further. The wealthy suffered differently, but just as severely. Rich Romans would pay fortunes for elaborate treatments that made them sicker, but because they were expensive and prestigious, families continued seeking them even after watching relatives die from the cure. Wealthy patients became walking experiments for ambitious doctors, who used them to test increasingly exotic treatments, knowing that rich patients' families were less likely to cause trouble if something went wrong. The poor, ironically, sometimes fared better because they couldn't afford elaborate medical treatments. They relied on folk remedies, midwives, and family care that, while often ineffective, was usually less actively harmful than professional medical intervention. Poor women gave birth with the help of experienced midwives who understood practical obstetrics better than physicians who had learned anatomy from books written by people who had never seen a live birth done. The system also created a thriving market for medical fraud. Fake doctors proliferated because there was no way to distinguish them from real doctors. Everyone was essentially making it up as they went along. Some of the most successful medical practitioners in the ancient world were complete frauds who had never received any medical training at all, but who had figured out that confidence and expensive equipment could substitute for knowledge. Perhaps most tragically, this chaotic system actually delayed genuine medical progress. Real medical discoveries were often ignored or forgotten because they came from the wrong people or didn't fit with popular medical theories. Effective treatments were abandoned in favor of fashionable ones, and promising research was dismissed if it contradicted established practitioners. The long-term consequences shaped medical practice for centuries. The association between medicine and quackery that developed in the ancient world persisted well into the modern era, contributing to public skepticism about medical authority that continues today. The idea that medical treatment should be expensive and complicated to be effective became so deeply ingrained that simple, effective treatments were often rejected in favor of elaborate, expensive ones. Yet even as civilian medicine was descending into pure chaos, something else was happening in temples and religious healing centers throughout the ancient world. While street doctors were competing to see who could come up with the most creative ways to kill their patients, temple healers were developing what they claimed was a completely different approach to medicine, one based on divine intervention rather than human knowledge. These weren't just the Asclepian snake temples we talked about earlier. All across the ancient world, religious institutions were setting up healing centers that promised to bypass the uncertainties of human medicine entirely. Why trust a doctor who might kill you when you could put your faith in gods who would definitely kill you, but at least with style and proper ceremony? The temple healing system represented the ancient world's attempt to solve the medical crisis through supernatural means. If human doctors couldn't be trusted to cure diseases, maybe divine doctors could. If medical knowledge was unreliable, maybe faith could substitute for expertise. It was a logical response to medical chaos, but logic and effectiveness aren't the same thing, as the ancient world was about to discover in the most dramatic and horrifying ways possible. By the 2nd century CE, the medical situation in the ancient world had reached a breaking point that would make modern healthcare crises look like minor scheduling conflicts. You had military hospitals that were essentially government-sponsored death factories. Civilian doctors who were competing to see who can invent the most creative ways to kill people while charging premium prices. And now temple healing centers that promised divine intervention but delivered what can only be described as religious malpractice with a side of food poisoning. The crisis came to a head when multiple plagues started sweeping through the Roman Empire simultaneously. The Antonine plague, probably smallpox, was killing people faster than doctors could figure out new ways to make them sicker. Meanwhile, various local epidemics were popping up like a deadly game of whack-a-mole, and the entire ancient medical establishment was failing so spectacularly that people were starting to wonder if maybe the barbarians had better healthcare options. The key players in this medical disaster included Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who was watching his empire literally die around him; Galen, who was desperately trying to maintain his reputation as a miracle doctor while everyone he treated kept dying; the priests of various healing temples who were running out of excuses for why the gods weren't answering anyone's prayers; and millions of desperate, sick people who were caught between incompetent human medicine and apparently indifferent divine medicine. The stakes couldn't have been higher. This wasn't just about individual patients anymore. Entire cities were being depopulated by diseases that no one understood and no one could treat effectively. The Roman military was losing more soldiers to disease than to combat. Trade was collapsing because merchants were afraid to travel to infected areas, and the entire social fabric of the ancient world was unraveling as people lost faith in both human and divine medicine. If something didn't change soon, the greatest civilization in human history was going to be brought down not by barbarian invasions or political upheaval, but by really, really bad healthcare. The breaking point came in 166 CE when the Antonine plague reached Rome itself, turning the capital of the civilized world into what contemporary sources described as a giant open-air morgue with delusions of grandeur. The emperor's personal physician, Galen himself, was suddenly faced with treating the most powerful man in the world during the worst medical crisis in Roman history. This was Galen's moment to prove that his revolutionary medical theories could save the empire. Spoiler alert, they couldn't. Marcus Aurelius fell ill with what was probably smallpox, though Galen confidently diagnosed it as an imbalance of hot and cold humors caused by excessive philosophical contemplation, because apparently, thinking too hard about stoicism could give you a deadly disease. Galen's treatment plan was a masterpiece of ancient medical thinking. First, he would bleed the emperor to reduce the hot humors, then purge him to eliminate the cold humors, then feed him a special diet of foods that would restore humoral balance, and finally perform a series of what he called pneumatic adjustments to optimize the emperor's breathing. The bloodletting began at dawn in the imperial palace, with Galen dramatically explaining to a room full of terrified courtiers exactly how he was going to save the empire by draining its leader's blood. The emperor's fever indicates an excess of sanguine humor, Galen announced, making an incision in Marcus Aurelius's arm, which must be drawn off to restore balance. As blood flowed into a golden bowl, Galen continued his lecture on humoral theory, completely oblivious to the fact that he was weakening a man who was already fighting for his life. When the bleeding failed to reduce the emperor's fever, shocking, I know, Galen moved to phase 2, purging. He administered a mixture of herbs that would, in his words, evacuate the corrupt humors through the natural channels. What this actually meant was giving the emperor of Rome explosive diarrhea while he was dying of smallpox. Contemporary accounts describe Marcus Aurelius becoming so weak that he could barely speak, but Galen interpreted this as a sign that the treatment was working because the corrupt humors are being expelled, allowing the natural vitality to return. Meanwhile, outside the palace, Rome was descending into medical chaos. The city's physicians were completely overwhelmed, not because there were too many patients, but because every doctor was trying a different approach to treating the plague, and none of them were working. Some doctors were bleeding everyone they lay. Doctors were bleeding everyone they could find. Others were purging entire neighborhoods. And still others were prescribing elaborate combinations of exotic herbs that were supposed to ward off disease, but mostly just made people hallucinate before they died. The temple priests weren't handling the crisis any better. The priests of Asclepius claimed that the plague was a test from the gods and that only the truly faithful would survive, which was a convenient way to explain why their snake-based healing rituals weren't preventing anyone from dying. Meanwhile, the priests of other healing gods were competing to see who could come up with the most elaborate explanations for divine medical failure. The priests of Apollo claimed that the sun god was angry about insufficient sacrifices. The priests of Isis insisted that the plague was punishment for not properly honoring Egyptian medical wisdom. And everyone was basically making it up as they went along while people died in the streets. The real drama came when Galen's treatment began to obviously fail. Marcus Aurelius was getting sicker despite, or more likely because of, the constant bleeding and purging. The emperor's advisors began whispering that maybe they should try a different approach. But Galen doubled down on his methods with the confidence that only comes from complete ignorance combined with massive ego. The emperor's condition proves the severity of his humoral imbalance, Galen declared, which requires more intensive treatment, not less. In a scene that perfectly captures the insanity of ancient medicine, Galen decided that what Marcus Aurelius really needed was trepanation, drilling a hole in his skull to release the corrupted humors that were obviously causing his fever. Picture this: the most famous doctor in the ancient world, in the middle of the worst plague in Roman history, preparing to drill a hole in the emperor's head because his made-up medical theory demanded it. Fortunately for Marcus Aurelius, and probably for the entire Roman Empire, the emperor lost consciousness before Galen could start drilling, which the doctor interpreted as the humors finally beginning to balance rather than, the emperor going into shock from blood loss and dehydration. The climax came when word spread through Rome that the emperor was dying despite receiving treatment from the greatest physician in the world. If Galen couldn't save Marcus Aurelius, what hope did ordinary people have? The city erupted in riots, not political riots, but medical riots, crowds of desperate people attacking doctors, burning down medical schools, and storming temples to demand explanations from the gods about why their supposedly infallible healing systems were failing so spectacularly. The response was immediate and chaotic. Marcus Aurelius, perhaps realizing that his doctor was going to kill him faster than the plague, dismissed Galen and placed himself under the care of his wife and a trusted servant who had no medical training whatsoever. Remarkably, with no further medical intervention, the emperor began to recover, slowly and partially, but he survived, which was more than could be said for most of Galen's other patients during the plague. Galen, faced with the embarrassing fact that his most famous patient had only started recovering after firing him, performed one of the greatest acts of medical spin in history. He claimed that his treatments had worked exactly as intended. The bloodletting and purging had eliminated the corrupt humors, and the emperor's recovery proved the effectiveness of Galenic medicine. The fact that Marcus Aurelius had only started improving after stopping treatment was, according to Galen, evidence of perfect timing. He had removed the diseased humors at exactly the right moment, allowing the body's natural healing processes to take over. The Roman people weren't buying it. Trust in professional medicine collapsed so completely that doctors began leaving the city to avoid angry mobs. Some physicians fled to distant provinces where news of their failures hadn't yet spread, while others abandoned medicine entirely and took up safer professions like gladiator training or lion taming. The few doctors who remained in Rome found themselves having to practice in secret, meeting patients in hidden locations and using assumed names. The temple healing system fared even worse. When divine intervention failed to stop a plague, people began questioning whether the gods were actually capable of healing anyone. Temple revenues plummeted as desperate families stopped donating to healing shrines that clearly weren't working. Some temples tried to rebrand themselves as general-purpose religious centers rather than specifically medical ones, while others simply shut down and converted their sacred healing pools into public baths. The broader Roman population developed what can only be described as medical nihilism, a complete loss of faith in any form of organized healthcare. People began treating themselves using folk remedies, family traditions, and pure intuition, figuring that if they were going to die anyway, they might as well die without paying medical fees. Ironically, this probably saved thousands of lives, since doing nothing was often safer than receiving professional ancient medical care. The plague crisis also created an interesting social phenomenon: the rise of medical survivors' guilt among doctors who realized their treatments were actually making people sicker. Some physicians experienced what we might recognize today as moral injury, becoming depressed and unable to continue practicing because they understood that they were harming the people they were trying to help. A few doctors even wrote confessions admitting that they didn't actually know what they were doing, though these admissions were generally ignored by medical authorities, who preferred to maintain the fiction of professional competence. The crisis fundamentally changed the relationship between doctors and patients in the ancient world. Before the plague, patients had generally trusted medical authority, even when treatments failed. After watching the most famous doctor in the world nearly kill the emperor with his advanced medical techniques, patients became skeptical consumers who demanded explanations, second opinions, and proof that treatments actually worked. This medical crisis wasn't just about failed treatments. It revealed fundamental flaws in how ancient civilization understood knowledge, expertise, and authority. The Antonine Plague exposed the fact that ancient medicine was essentially an elaborate confidence game based on theories that sounded sophisticated but had no basis in reality. What the crisis revealed about ancient society was deeply disturbing. The entire medical establishment, doctors, priests, teachers, and government officials, had built their authority on claims of knowledge they didn't actually possess. When tested by a real crisis, the whole system collapsed like a house of cards built on quicksand during an earthquake. The people who were supposed to be experts turned out to be no more knowledgeable than random people off the street. But they were charging money for their ignorance and getting people killed in the process. The plague also demonstrated how dangerous it could be when incompetent authorities refused to admit their limitations. Galen's insistence on continuing treatments that were obviously making Marcus Aurelius sicker showed how professional pride and economic interests could override basic human decency. The medical establishment's response to failure was to blame patients, make excuses, and double down on failed approaches rather than acknowledge that they might be wrong. Perhaps most importantly, the crisis showed that ancient medical knowledge wasn't just ineffective, it was actively harmful. Patients who received no treatment often fared better than those who received professional medical care, which meant that the entire medical system was worse than useless. It was a negative value industry that consumed resources, caused suffering, and prevented people from discovering approaches that might actually work. This realization would have long-lasting effects on how people thought about medical authority, professional expertise, and the relationship between knowledge and power. The Antonine Plague crisis marked the beginning of a more skeptical, questioning approach to medical claims that would eventually contribute to the development of more scientific approaches to healthcare. But the immediate aftermath was chaos, as the collapse of medical authority left people with no reliable system for dealing with illness and injury. The question facing the ancient world was, if professional medicine didn't work and divine intervention was unreliable, what were people supposed to do when they got sick? The answer would involve some very creative and often very dangerous improvisation around the main medical disasters we've been exploring. A colorful cast of supporting characters was busy making ancient healthcare even more entertaining and deadly. These weren't the famous names you'd find in medical textbooks. They were the everyday practitioners, patients and charlatans who turned ancient medicine into a chaotic carnival of incompetence. Meet Demetrius the tooth puller, who operated out of a stall in the Roman Forum and claimed to be able to extract teeth painlessly using a secret technique he'd learned from Egyptian priests. Demetrius's painless method involved getting patients drunk on cheap wine, then yanking their teeth out with pliers while they were unconscious. The catch was that Demetrius bought his wine from the cheapest supplier in Rome, which meant it was frequently contaminated with lead, mercury, or whatever other toxic substances the seller thought would add flavor. Patients would come to Demetrius with toothaches and leave with lead poisoning, but hey, their teeth didn't hurt anymore because they were too busy dying to notice dental pain. Demetrius had a thriving business for years because his customers couldn't complain. The dead ones literally couldn't, and the living ones were too brain damaged from toxic wine to form coherent sentences. Then there was Claudia the midwife, who represented the terrifying world of ancient obstetrics. Claudia had learned her trade from her mother, who had learned it from her mother, creating a multi-generational dynasty of childbirth disasters. Claudia's approach to difficult deliveries involved a combination of prayer, herbal remedies that were mostly just weeds she picked from roadside ditches, and what she called manual assistance, which was basically just yanking on babies until something happened. Her success rate was so poor that Roman women started referring to pregnancy as taking the Claudia gamble. But she remained popular because she was cheap and would take payment in the form of chickens or household goods. Claudia also offered post-birth services like humor balancing for new mothers, which involved bleeding women who had just given birth because she believed childbirth created an excess of blood that needed to be drained. The fact that many of her patients died from blood loss shortly after delivery didn't deter Claudia's confidence in her methods. She just assumed they had been too weak to survive proper medical treatment. Perhaps most fascinating was Marcus, the dream interpreter, who had found a brilliant way to combine medicine with fortune-telling. Marcus claimed that diseases were messages from the gods that can only be properly understood through dream analysis. Patients would describe their symptoms to Marcus, who would then interpret these as symbolic dreams and prescribe treatments based on what he thought the gods were trying to communicate. A headache might be interpreted as the god Apollo trying to grant the patient poetic inspiration. So the treatment would involve writing verses while standing on one foot at dawn. Stomach problems were obviously messages from Ceres about agricultural issues, so patients would be instructed to plant gardens and tend them until their symptoms improved. Marcus had an answer for everything because dream interpretation is infinitely flexible. Any outcome could be explained as either successful divine communication or the patient's failure to properly understand the message. His practice was enormously successful among wealthy Romans, who liked the idea that their illnesses made them special recipients of divine attention rather than just randomly sick people. The most tragic character was probably Gaius the Sincere, one of the few ancient doctors who actually tried to practice honest medicine. Gaius kept careful records of his treatments and their outcomes, only prescribed remedies he had personally tested, and admitted when he didn't know how to help someone. He charged reasonable fees, treated poor patients for free, and spent his own money studying medical texts from different cultures to expand his knowledge. Naturally, Gaius was a complete failure as a businessman because honesty and humility weren't exactly selling points in the ancient medical marketplace. while charlatans like Demetrius and Marcus were getting rich by promising miraculous cures. Gaius was going broke by telling people the truth about the limitations of ancient medicine. He eventually gave up his practice and became a farmer, probably saving more lives by growing food than he ever had by practicing medicine. These weren't isolated incidents floating around independently. The ancient medical world was a tightly interconnected web of relationships, rivalries, and mutual incompetence that created feedback loops of medical disaster. The story of how these characters' lives intersected reads like a dark comedy about the dangers of professional networking in a field where everyone was making everything up. Demetrius the tooth puller and Claudia the midwife, for example, had developed what they called a referral partnership. When Demetrius's patients survived their tooth extractions but developed lead poisoning from his contaminated wine, he would send them to Claudia for blood purification therapy. Claudia would then bleed these already poisoned patients, often killing them in the process. But since they had come to her with existing medical problems, no one blamed her for their deaths. Meanwhile, when Claudia's patients developed infections after childbirth, which happened constantly because she never washed her hands or sterilized her tools, she would send them to Demetrius for dental realignment therapy, claiming that tooth problems were causing their fevers. Demetrius would then extract perfectly healthy teeth from women suffering from post-birth infections, charging them money to make their medical problems worse. This referral system created a medical money pit, where patients would bounce back and forth between practitioners, getting progressively sicker and poorer until they either died or ran out of money. But both Demetrius and Claudia could point to their partnership as evidence of their professionalism. After all, they were working collaboratively and referring patients to specialists when appropriate, which sounds very modern and scientific. Until you realize that both specialists were completely incompetent. Marcus, the dream interpreter, had developed an even more elaborate network of professional relationships. He partnered with temple priests who would confirm his dream interpretations through ritual consultations, with astrologers who would provide supporting cosmic evidence for his diagnoses, and with herbalists who would supply the exotic remedies his dream-based treatments required. This created what was essentially an ancient medical pyramid scheme, where each practitioner took a cut of the fees while passing patients around the network until they were either cured by accident or died from the accumulated effects of multiple treatments. The really insidious part was that this network provided mutual protection from criticism. If a patient died after receiving treatment from multiple practitioners, no single doctor could be held responsible. They could all blame the others or claim that the patient's condition was too advanced for any treatment to be effective. If someone questioned the effectiveness of dream interpretation, Marcus could point to the temple priests and astrologers who supported his methods. If anyone criticized the herbalist remedies, they could claim that the dream interpretation or astrological timing must have been wrong. Even Gaius the Sincere got caught up in these networks, though unwillingly. Other doctors would refer their most hopeless cases to him, knowing that he was honest enough to admit when he couldn't help someone. This allowed them to tell families that they had consulted with the most respected physician in the city. And when Gaius confirmed that the patient was beyond help, the referring doctors could claim they had done everything possible. Gaius became unwittingly complicit in a system that used his honesty to provide cover for other doctors' incompetence. The web of relationships extended beyond just medical practitioners. Wealthy patients would compare notes on which doctors they were using, creating social pressure to consult the most expensive and fashionable physicians, regardless of their actual effectiveness. Poor patients, meanwhile, would share information about which doctors were cheapest, leading to a race to the bottom where the most affordable practitioners were usually the most dangerous ones. Political connections also played a crucial role. Doctors who treated prominent politicians or wealthy merchants could use these relationships to enhance their reputations and attract more patients. Meanwhile, doctors who somehow offended powerful people could find themselves suddenly without customers, regardless of their medical skills. This created incentives for physicians to prioritize social networking over medical competence, leading to a healthcare system where who you knew was more important than what you knew. To understand how these medical disasters could flourish, you have to understand the cultural context that made ancient medicine possible. Daily life in the ancient world was so precarious, violent, and unpredictable that bad medical care often wasn't dramatically different from just regular life. When your normal day might include food poisoning from contaminated water, injuries from dangerous working conditions, and diseases from poor sanitation, the additional risks from incompetent medical treatment weren't necessarily obvious. Ancient people had very different expectations about pain, suffering, and death than we do today. A treatment that left you sicker than when you started wasn't necessarily seen as medical malpractice. It might just be seen as bad luck, divine displeasure, or the natural course of illness. When life expectancy was around 35 years, and infant mortality was over 50%, people were accustomed to medical interventions that didn't work and sometimes made things worse. The social structure of ancient civilizations also supported medical incompetence in ways that seem bizarre today. In a world where social class determined almost everything about your life, it made sense that wealthy people would receive different medical treatment than poor people. But this meant that effective treatments discovered while caring for poor patients might never be applied to wealthy ones. And expensive but useless treatments used on the rich might never be tested on anyone who could afford to complain about poor results. Religious beliefs permeated every aspect of ancient medicine in ways that made rational evaluation of treatments almost impossible. When illness was seen as divine punishment, moral failing, or spiritual imbalance, the effectiveness of medical treatment was secondary to its religious appropriateness. A treatment that made you sicker might still be considered successful if it was spiritually purifying, while a treatment that made you healthier might be rejected if it was religiously suspect. The economic system of the ancient world also created perverse incentives for medical practice. Most ancient doctors were either slaves, freedmen, or lower-class citizens who depended on wealthy patrons for their livelihood. This meant that keeping patients happy was often more important than keeping them healthy. A doctor who told a wealthy patient unpleasant truths about their condition might find themselves out of work, while a doctor who provided comforting lies and expensive treatments could build a thriving practice. What was considered normal versus exceptional in ancient medicine was completely backwards from modern standards. Treatments that killed patients were normal and expected, while treatments that actually worked were considered miraculous and probably suspicious. Doctors who admitted the limitations of their knowledge were seen as incompetent, while doctors who claimed to cure everything were seen as skilled professionals. Perhaps most ironic was the fact that the ancient world's worst medical practitioners were often its most successful ones, while the doctors who might have actually helped people were driven out of business by market forces that rewarded confidence over competence. Demetrius the tooth puller made more money than honest physicians because his customers died before they could complain about his services, creating what economists would recognize as a perfect information asymmetry problem, the contradiction. At the heart of ancient medicine was that everyone acknowledged it was dangerous and often ineffective, but they continued using it anyway because the alternatives seemed even worse. People knew that going to a doctor might kill them, but they also believed that not going to a doctor when sick was a form of suicide. This created a medical culture based on fatalistic resignation rather than rational decision-making. Another fascinating contradiction was that Ancient medical texts were often quite sophisticated and observant about human anatomy and disease symptoms, but the treatments they prescribed were completely unrelated to their accurate observations. Ancient doctors could describe diseases with remarkable precision, then prescribe treatments that showed they understood nothing about what actually caused those diseases. The most tragic irony was that some of the most effective medical interventions in the ancient world were performed by people who weren't considered medical practitioners at all. Midwives who had learned practical obstetrics through experience, military veterans who had learned battlefield surgery, and herbalists who had discovered effective remedies through trial and error. These people were often more competent than trained physicians, but they couldn't charge professional fees or attract wealthy patients because they lacked the social status and theoretical knowledge that ancient societies associated with medical expertise. Modern parallels to these contradictions are depressingly easy to find. We still have healthcare systems where the most expensive treatments aren't necessarily the most effective ones, where professional credentials don't always correlate with actual competence, and where market incentives sometimes reward providers for keeping patients sick rather than making them healthy. The main difference is that we now have scientific methods for evaluating medical effectiveness, but we don't always use them. And we certainly don't always structure our healthcare systems around them. Everything changed when the ancient world experienced what historians now call the Great Medical Awakening of the 3rd century CE. Though awakening might be too generous a term for what was really more like a collective realization that maybe, just maybe, the current healthcare system was actively trying to kill everyone. This moment of clarity came not from brilliant medical insights or revolutionary discoveries, but from the simple observation that places without doctors seem to have fewer dead people than places with doctors. The turning point began in the remote provinces of the Roman Empire, where medical services were scarce and people had been forced to rely on folk remedies, practical experience, and what we might call intuitive healthcare. Basically just doing whatever seemed sensible instead of whatever some doctor told them to do. Administrators in these provinces began noticing that their mortality rates were actually lower than in Rome and other major cities that had access to the finest medical care money could buy. This was like discovering that restaurants without chefs serve better food than establishments with trained culinary professionals. The first official documentation of this phenomenon came from a Roman governor in Britain who wrote to the Senate, complaining that he couldn't recruit enough soldiers because too many young men in major cities were dying from medical treatment. Meanwhile, in rural areas where doctors were rare, he was finding plenty of healthy recruits who had somehow managed to survive childhood without professional medical intervention. His letter, preserved in Roman archives, included the memorable line, "It appears that the barbarians' ignorance of proper medicine has accidentally made them healthier than civilized people." What made this moment different from previous criticisms of ancient medicine was that it wasn't coming from medical rivals or disgruntled patients. It was coming from government officials who were trying to run an empire and were finding that medical care was actually counterproductive to imperial goals. When your military recruitment is being hampered by your own healthcare system, that's a pretty clear sign that something has gone fundamentally wrong. The key factors that led to this transformation included the growing literacy rates among the general population, which meant more people could read medical texts and realize that different doctors were prescribing completely contradictory treatments for the same conditions. There was also increasing trade contact with other civilizations, particularly in Asia, where travelers discovered that different cultures had completely different approaches to medicine that seemed to work just as well, or better than Roman methods. Perhaps most importantly, the repeated plague outbreaks had created a generation of survivors who had learned to be deeply skeptical of medical authority. These were people who had watched family members die from cures while seeing others recover through neglect. And they weren't interested in polite theories about why professional medicine deserved respect despite its obvious failures. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It unfolded through a series of small rebellions against medical authority that gradually snowballed into a complete restructuring of how people thought about healthcare. The process began with individual patients quietly ignoring their doctor's advice, progressed to communities organizing alternative healing systems, and eventually reached the point where entire regions were systematically rejecting traditional medical practice. Resistance to change came from exactly the sources you'd expect. The medical establishment fought back with everything they had, which was mainly theoretical arguments and professional indignation. Galen's followers published treatises explaining why empirical observation was less reliable than classical medical theory, arguing that just because people seemed healthier without medical treatment didn't mean they actually were healthier. They might be suffering from invisible spiritual ailments that only trained physicians could detect. It was like insisting that invisible unicorns were more real than visible horses, because unicorns were more theoretically interesting. The medical schools doubled down on complexity, introducing even more elaborate theoretical frameworks to explain why their treatments were scientifically superior to folk remedies that actually worked. They developed new classifications of diseases, more sophisticated humoral theories, and increasingly ornate diagnostic procedures that required years of study to master. The obvious goal was to make medicine so complicated that ordinary people wouldn't dare question professional expertise, even when that expertise was killing them. But the champions of change were emerging from unexpected places. Military veterans who had learned practical battlefield medicine were setting up informal clinics that focused on simple, effective treatments rather than theoretical sophistication. Midwives were organizing networks to share practical knowledge about childbirth and infant care. Even some educated Romans were beginning to experiment with what they called philosophical medicine, healthcare approaches based on observation and reasoning rather than inherited tradition. The specific steps of transformation varied by region, but they generally followed a predictable pattern. First, communities would stop consulting doctors for minor ailments, treating themselves with household remedies and common sense. When this proved successful, they would extend the approach to more serious conditions. Eventually, they would establish informal healthcare systems, run by people who had practical experience rather than formal training. The obstacles encountered were significant and sometimes violent. Professional physicians lobbied local governments to ban unlicensed medical practice, arguing that public safety required properly trained practitioners. Some regions passed laws requiring medical licensing, but these were often ignored or circumvented by communities that had lost faith in licensed practitioners. There were even documented cases of riots when authorities tried to force sick people to receive professional medical treatment against their will. Breakthrough moments occurred when prominent public figures began openly rejecting medical advice and recovering from illnesses that doctors had declared fatal. Marcus Claudius Tacitus, who would later become emperor, famously dismissed his physicians during a serious illness and recovered using nothing but rest, simple food, and what he called intelligent neglect. When word spread that a future emperor had cured himself by ignoring medical experts, it became socially acceptable for others to do the same. The role of individuals versus larger forces in driving change was complex and sometimes contradictory. While individual acts of medical rebellion were important, they were enabled by broader social and economic changes that were already undermining traditional authority structures. The Roman Empire was becoming more diverse, more literate, and more connected to other cultures, all of which made it harder to maintain medical orthodoxies based on narrow classical traditions. Women played a particularly important role in medical Transformation because they had always been excluded from formal medical training but were responsible for most day-to-day healthcare decisions. As mothers, wives, and daughters, they could observe the effects of different treatments on their families, and they were often the first to notice that professional medical intervention seemed to make people sicker rather than healthier. Women's informal networks became crucial channels for spreading information about alternative healing approaches. The economic dynamics of change were also significant. As more people began avoiding professional medical care, the economics of medical practice shifted dramatically. Doctors who charged high fees for elaborate treatments found their patient base shrinking, while practitioners who offered simple, affordable services attracted growing numbers of clients. This created market pressure for medical innovation, but not necessarily the kind of innovation that medical schools were producing. Regional differences in the pace of change reflected local political, economic, and cultural factors. Urban areas with strong medical establishments were slower to change than rural regions where formal medical services had always been limited. Wealthy communities that could afford expensive medical care were more resistant to change than poor communities that had been priced out of professional medicine anyway. The new healthcare landscape that emerged from this transformation was radically different from the classical medical system, though whether it was actually better is a matter of debate that historians are still arguing about. What was unquestionably different was that medical authority had been fundamentally decentralized, shifting from a small number of highly trained professionals to a large number of practitioners with varying levels of skill and experience. The new system was characterized by what we might call pragmatic pluralism. Instead of one dominant medical tradition, there were dozens of different approaches to healthcare competing for patients and proving their effectiveness through results, rather than theoretical sophistication. Traditional Gallic medicine still existed, but it was just one option among many, and it had to compete with folk healing, foreign medical traditions, military surgery, religious healing, and various hybrid approaches that combined elements from different systems. Professional medical training became less important than practical experience and demonstrated results. People who could actually help patients, regardless of their formal credentials, found themselves in demand, while physicians with impressive qualifications but poor outcomes struggled to maintain their practices. This created what economists would recognize as a more efficient medical marketplace, where value was determined by actual performance rather than professional reputation. The rules and norms of medical practice changed dramatically. Doctors could no longer expect automatic deference from patients. They had to explain their reasoning, justify their treatments, and accept that patients might seek second opinions or choose alternative practitioners. Medical fees became more competitive, and practitioners had to offer evidence of their effectiveness rather than simply asserting their authority. Regional variations in medical practice became much more pronounced, as different communities developed healthcare systems adapted to local conditions, resources, and cultural preferences. What worked in urban Rome might be completely inappropriate for rural Gaul, and practitioners learned to adapt their methods to local circumstances rather than trying to impose universal treatments. The new medical landscape was messier and more chaotic than the old system, but it was also more responsive to patient needs and more willing to abandon approaches that didn't work. Innovation became more common because practitioners weren't constrained by rigid, theoretical frameworks that prohibited experimentation. This led to genuine medical advances, but also to new forms of quackery that were sometimes just as dangerous as the old ones. Patient empowerment became a defining characteristic of the new system. People took more responsibility for their own healthcare decisions, learned to evaluate different treatment options, and developed more realistic expectations about what medical intervention could and couldn't accomplish. This was both liberating and terrifying. Patients had more control over their care, but they also had to take more responsibility for the outcomes. The social status of medical practitioners changed significantly. Doctors were no longer automatically regarded as learned authorities whose word was law. Instead, they became service providers who had to earn trust through competence and maintain it through continued good results. This was probably healthier for society, but it was definitely less lucrative for doctors. What stayed the same was that people still got sick, still needed help when they were injured, and still wanted someone to blame when medical treatment didn't work. The fundamental human desire for medical certainty persisted even in a system that was more honest about the limitations of medical knowledge. People adapted to uncertainty better than anyone expected, but they never stopped hoping for miracle cures and perfect treatments. Was this transformation actually an improvement? The answer depends on how you measure success, and different groups had very different perspectives on whether the changes represented progress or decline. From a public health standpoint, the evidence suggests that decentralizing medical authority probably saved lives by reducing exposure to actively harmful treatments, but it also meant that genuinely effective medical knowledge was sometimes lost or ignored along with the ineffective practices. The short-term effects were generally positive. For most people, mortality rates declined in regions that moved away from traditional medical practice, particularly for conditions that had been routinely overtreated by classical physicians. Women and children who had been disproportionately harmed by aggressive medical interventions showed the most dramatic improvements in survival rates. Military medicine also improved significantly as practical battlefield surgery replaced theoretical approaches that had proven disastrous in actual combat. However, the long-term consequences were more mixed. While the new system was better at avoiding harmful treatments, it was also less systematic about preserving and transmitting medical knowledge. The classical medical tradition, for all its flaws, had at least attempted to maintain written records and standardized training. The new, more decentralized system relied heavily on oral tradition and personal experience, which meant that medical knowledge could be easily lost when practitioners died or moved away. The unintended consequences included the proliferation of new forms of medical fraud that were sometimes more sophisticated than the old ones. While traditional physicians had been incompetent, they had at least been recognizably professional. The new medical marketplace included everyone from genuinely skilled healers to complete charlatans, and patients didn't always have reliable ways to distinguish between them. Modern judgment of this transformation is complicated by our own biases about medical professionalization and scientific method. From our perspective, the ancient world's move away from systematic medical education looks like a step backwards, even if it produced better short-term health outcomes. We value medical research, standardized training, and professional accountability in ways that make ancient medical anarchism seem chaotic and dangerous. But contemporary views were much more positive. People who lived through the transformation generally believed they were better off with the new system, even if it was messier and less prestigious than the old one. They valued practical results over theoretical sophistication, and they were willing to accept some chaos in exchange for medical care that didn't actively try to kill them. In the years and decades following the Great Medical Awakening, the ancient world discovered that rejecting bad medicine was easier than developing good medicine. While communities had successfully freed themselves from the tyranny of incompetent physicians, they now faced the challenge of building healthcare systems that were actually helpful rather than just less harmful than what came before. It was like escaping from a burning building, only to realize you were now standing in a swamp filled with alligators. Technically an improvement, but still not exactly where you wanted to be. The immediate aftermath saw the emergence of what historians call therapeutic regionalism different parts of the former Roman Empire developed completely different approaches to medical care based on local resources, cultural preferences, and whatever happened to work in their specific circumstances. Gaul developed a medical tradition based heavily on herbal remedies and what would now be recognized as rudimentary psychology. Britannia evolved a system that combined Celtic folk healing with practical Roman military surgery. Egypt maintained some classical medical practices while incorporating traditional healing methods that had existed long before the Greeks and Romans arrived. New challenges emerged that nobody had anticipated during the rebellion against classical medicine. Without standardized medical training, there was no reliable way to distinguish between genuinely skilled healers and creative fraudsters. The decentralized system that had liberated communities from incompetent physicians also made them vulnerable to a new generation of medical entrepreneurs who were often more interested in profit than healing. At least the old system's failures had been predictably incompetent. The new system's failures were creatively unpredictable. The evolution of medical practice also created unexpected social tensions. Communities that had successfully rejected traditional medicine sometimes became hostile to any form of systematic medical knowledge, viewing professional expertise as inherently suspicious regardless of its actual effectiveness. This anti-intellectual backlash occasionally went too far, leading to the rejection of genuinely useful medical insights along with the useless theoretical frameworks they had originally sought to escape. Second-generation effects included the gradual loss of medical literacy among the general population. While the first generation of medical reformers had been educated enough to critically evaluate classical medical texts and identify their flaws, their children and grandchildren often lacked the knowledge to make similar distinctions. This created a cycle where useful medical knowledge was gradually forgotten along with the harmful practices, leaving communities with healthcare systems that were less dangerous than classical medicine, but also less sophisticated. The transformation also had unexpected economic consequences. The collapse of professional medical authority eliminated a significant source of employment for educated Romans, particularly freed slaves and lower-class citizens who had used medical practice as a thieves' path to social mobility. Some former physicians successfully transitioned to other occupations, but many found themselves economically displaced by changes they had not anticipated and could not control. The medical vacuum left by the decline of classical physicians was filled by an eclectic mix of new practitioners who brought fresh perspectives to healthcare, though not always improvements. These weren't necessarily better healers than their predecessors, but they were different healers, and in the ancient world, different often counted as progress, even when it wasn't actually better. The most successful new medical practitioners were military veterans who had learned battlefield surgery and wound care through brutal trial and error. These men, and they were almost exclusively men, had no formal medical training, but they understood trauma, infection, and emergency care in ways that civilian physicians never had. Marcus Brutus Calvus, a former centurion who set up practice in southern Gaul, became famous for his ability to treat injuries that would have been fatal under traditional medical care. His methods were simple, practical, and effective. Clean wounds thoroughly, remove foreign objects, control bleeding, and let the body heal itself. Revolutionary concepts. Apparently, Calvus and other veteran medics differed dramatically from classical physicians in their approach to patient care. They had no interest in elaborate theories about humors or divine intervention. They focused on immediate, practical problems and simple solutions. Their military experience had taught them that complicated procedures performed under stressful conditions usually went wrong. So they developed streamlined treatment protocols that prioritized effectiveness over theoretical sophistication. When a patient came to Calvus with a broken bone, he set it and splinted it. When traditional physicians had treated the same injury, they had typically bled the patient, purged them, performed ritual cleansings, and consulted astrological charts before eventually getting around to dealing with the actual broken bone. Another important group of new practitioners were women who had been excluded from formal medical training but had extensive practical experience with healthcare. Livia Marcella, a former slave who had worked as a household healer, established what was essentially the ancient world's first outpatient clinic in a converted shop in Rome. She specialized in treating women and children, areas where classical medicine had been particularly dangerous and ineffective. Marcella's approach was revolutionary in its simplicity. She listened to patients, observed symptoms carefully, and tried treatments that had worked in similar cases before. When something didn't work, she tried something else instead of doubling down on failed approaches. These female practitioners often developed specializations that male physicians had largely ignored. Marcella became expert in treating what we would now recognize as postpartum depression, childhood illnesses, and women's reproductive health. Her success attracted patients from across the region, including wealthy women who had previously relied on expensive male physicians. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that the most effective medical care for women was being provided by practitioners who had been considered unqualified to treat anyone. Foreign medical traditions also gained prominence as the Roman empires increased. Cultural diversity exposed people to alternative approaches to healthcare. Chinese merchants introduced acupuncture and herbal medicine. Indian traders brought Ayurvedic practices, and Germanic tribes contributed their own folk healing traditions. These foreign systems weren't necessarily more effective than Roman medicine. They were different, and their novelty made them attractive to people who had lost faith in familiar medical approaches. Perhaps most interestingly, some former classical physicians successfully reinvented themselves by abandoning theoretical medicine in favor of practical approaches. Gaius Claudius Nero, who had been trained in the Galenic tradition, publicly renounced his classical education and began practicing what he called empirical healing, treatment based entirely on observation and experience rather than theoretical knowledge. Nero's conversion attracted significant attention because it represented a complete philosophical transformation from someone who understood both systems intimately. But some problems persisted despite the medical revolution, proving that incompetence is remarkably adaptable and can flourish under any system if given sufficient opportunity. The fundamental issue was that while the ancient world had successfully identified what didn't work in medicine, they hadn't necessarily figured out what did work, leading to new forms of medical failure that were sometimes just as dangerous as the old ones. Continuing challenges included the persistent problem of medical fraud, which simply evolved to match the new medical marketplace. Instead of fraudulent physicians claiming authority through classical training, there were now fraudulent healers claiming authority through military experience they'd never had, foreign medical knowledge they'd never learned, or divine inspiration they'd obviously never received. Demetrius the Tooth Puller, for example, reinvented himself as Demetrius the battle-tested healer, claiming he'd learned his techniques while serving with the legions in Germania, when in fact he'd never left Rome and learned everything he knew about medicine from watching other incompetent practitioners. The new medical system also struggled with quality control in ways that the old system hadn't. Classical medicine had been uniformly bad, but at least it had been predictably bad. You knew what you were getting when you consulted a traditionally trained physician. The new system included genuinely skilled healers alongside complete charlatans, and patients often had no reliable way to tell the difference until after they'd received treatment and could evaluate the results. New versions of old problems emerged as practitioners tried to systematize successful folk remedies without understanding why they worked. Herbal medicine, for example, became increasingly elaborate and expensive as healers competed to develop more exotic and impressive-sounding treatments. Simple, effective remedies were abandoned in favor of complex preparations that included rare ingredients and required elaborate preparation rituals. The commercialization of folk medicine often destroyed exactly the qualities that had made it effective in the first place. Cyclical patterns appeared as successful. New medical approaches gradually became corrupted by the same forces that had destroyed classical medicine. Practitioners who achieved good results began attracting wealthy patients who expected impressive, expensive treatments rather than simple, effective ones. This created pressure to elaborate on successful methods, adding unnecessary complexity that often reduced their effectiveness while increasing their cost, and prestige. Regional medical traditions that had initially been adaptive and responsive to local conditions sometimes became rigid orthodoxies that were just as resistant to change as classical medicine had been. Communities that had successfully developed effective healthcare approaches sometimes became so attached to their local methods that they refused to adopt improvements from other regions, even when those improvements were obviously beneficial. The problem of medical education remained largely unsolved. While apprenticeship systems had replaced formal medical schools, there was no systematic way to ensure that apprentices learned from competent masters rather than incompetent ones. The transmission of medical knowledge remained haphazard and unreliable, meaning that effective treatments could be easily lost while ineffective ones persisted, simply because they were easier to remember or more dramatic to perform. Certain issues proved intractable regardless of the medical system in use. Epidemic diseases continued to devastate communities because effective treatments for infectious diseases were beyond ancient medical knowledge regardless of who was providing care. Surgical infections remained a major problem because the concept of microbial contamination was unknown, meaning that even skilled surgeons killed patients through inadvertent sepsis. Obstetric mortality stayed high because the anatomical and physiological challenges of childbirth couldn't be overcome with ancient medical knowledge, no matter how practically oriented or well-intentioned the practitioners were. Compared to the earlier classical period, the post-awakening medical landscape was simultaneously more effective and more chaotic, creating a paradox that reveals important truths about the relationship between systematic knowledge and practical results. The new system was better at keeping people alive, but worse at preserving and transmitting medical knowledge, raising questions about whether short-term improvements in health outcomes were worth long-term losses in medical understanding. When compared to other regions during the same time period, the former Roman territories that had undergone medical transformation showed interesting patterns. Areas that had completely rejected classical medicine often had better immediate health outcomes than regions that had maintained traditional medical practices, but they also showed greater variation in results and less consistency in medical care quality. It was like comparing a chaotic but lively marketplace to a well-organized but dysfunctional bureaucracy. Both had serious problems, but they were different kinds of problems. What was unique about the Roman medical transformation was its scale and systematicity. While other civilizations had experienced medical reforms or adopted foreign medical practices, few had undergone such a complete rejection of their existing medical establishment. Chinese medicine had evolved gradually over centuries. Indian, Ayurvedic practice had developed through systematic philosophical inquiry, and Egyptian medicine had maintained continuity with ancient traditions. The Roman transformation was more like a medical revolution than evolution. What was universal across different medical systems was the tendency for successful medical practices to become corrupted by social, economic, and political pressures that had nothing to do with medical effectiveness. Whether you were looking at Chinese, Indian, Egyptian, or post-Roman medicine, the same patterns appeared. Initial success led to increased prestige, which attracted wealthy patients, which created pressure for elaborate and expensive treatments, which gradually undermined the simplicity and effectiveness that had made the system successful in the first place. The lessons that could be learned from the Roman medical transformation were both encouraging and sobering. On the positive side, the experience demonstrated that entrenched medical orthodoxies could be successfully challenged and replaced, that patients could learn to make informed decisions about their healthcare, and that practical experience was often more valuable than theoretical training. Communities could develop effective healthcare systems without relying on professional medical authorities, and medical innovation could flourish in decentralized, competitive environments. On the negative side, the transformation also showed how difficult it was to maintain medical progress once it had been achieved. Effective medical practices were vulnerable to the same corrupting influences that had destroyed classical medicine, and there was no guarantee that medical reforms would lead to permanent improvements rather than just different kinds of problems. Patterns that repeated elsewhere included the tendency for medical rebels to become medical orthodoxies, the challenge of distinguishing between effective and ineffective practitioners in unregulated medical markets, and the difficulty of preserving medical knowledge across generations without formal educational institutions. These patterns suggest that the problems of ancient medicine weren't simply due to ignorance or incompetence, but reflected deeper structural challenges that any medical system must address. By the 4th and 5th centuries CE, signs pointed to another major transformation in ancient medicine, though this time the change wasn't driven by grassroots rebellion against medical authority, but by the rise of new institutional powers that had their own ideas about how healthcare should be organized. The decentralized, pragmatic medical system that had emerged from the ruins of classical medicine was about to be challenged by forces that made the old Galenic physicians look like anarchist freethinkers. The warning signs were subtle at first, but became increasingly obvious to anyone paying attention. Christian monasteries were beginning to establish what they called hospitals, institutions that combined medical care with religious instruction and moral supervision. These weren't like the chaotic, market-driven healing centers that had flourished during the post-classical period. Monastic hospitals were highly organized, strictly regulated, and operated according to religious principles that prioritized spiritual healing over physical cure. When monks started claiming that prayer was more effective than practical medical treatment, veterans of the medical revolution began to worry that they were about to experience a hostile takeover by people who thought illness was primarily a moral problem. Political leaders were also showing increasing interest in regulating medical practice, not because they were particularly concerned about healthcare quality, but because unregulated medicine was becoming a source of social instability. When anyone could claim to be a healer, and desperate people were willing to try anything, medical fraud became a thriving industry that sometimes spilled over into political rebellion. Local authorities began passing laws requiring healers to obtain licenses, register with government officials, and submit to oversight by appointed medical boards. These regulations were presented as consumer protection measures, but veteran healers recognized them as attempts to reassert institutional control over medical practice. What key players could see versus what they missed reveals the limitations of even experienced medical rebels when faced with institutional pressure. Established healers like Marcus Brutus Calvus and Livia Marcella understood that their independence was being threatened, but they underestimated how effectively religious and political institutions could work together to reshape medical practice. They focused on defending their individual practices rather than organizing collective resistance to institutional encroachment, perhaps because their success had been based on rejecting organized medicine rather than creating alternative organizations. The resistance to inevitable change took predictable forms. Independent healers began forming loose associations to share information and coordinate responses to government regulation. Some practitioners moved their operations to more remote areas where institutional oversight was less effective. Others tried to adapt to the new environment by obtaining official recognition while maintaining their practical approaches to medical care. But the writing was on the wall, and some of it was literally written by monks who believed that earthly medicine was a distraction from spiritual healing. The Christian Church was emerging as a major political and social force throughout the former Roman Empire, and church leaders had very definite opinions about medical practice. They weren't opposed to healing the sick. That was considered a Christian duty, but they believed that true healing came from God, not from human knowledge or skill. This theological position was about to collide head-on with a medical culture that had spent decades learning to value practical results over theoretical authority. The end of the post-classical medical experiment came not with a bang but with a bureaucratic whimper, as the decentralized healing system was gradually absorbed into institutional structures that promised order, stability, and spiritual guidance along with medical care. It was like watching a vibrant street market being converted into a government-run department store, technically more organized, but somehow less alive and definitely less interesting. The specific events that marked the transition varied by region, but they generally followed a pattern of increasing regulation, religious oversight, and institutional consolidation that slowly strangled this independence and innovation that had characterized post-classical medicine. In Gaul, the process began when Bishop Caesarius of Arles established a series of monastic hospitals that offered free medical care to anyone willing to attend religious services and submit to moral instruction. These hospitals were staffed by monks who had received basic medical training along with their theological education, creating a new kind of medical practitioner who combined limited medical knowledge with unlimited religious authority. The monastic hospitals were initially welcomed by many communities because they offered more reliable and affordable medical care than the chaotic marketplace of independent healers. But the catch, and there's always a catch with institutional medicine, was that patients had to accept Christian supervision of their entire lives, not just their medical treatment. Monks didn't just treat diseases. They diagnosed sins, prescribed penances, and insisted that true healing required spiritual transformation as well as physical recovery. Meanwhile, secular authorities were implementing their own forms of medical control. The Byzantine Empire, which considered itself the legitimate heir to Roman civilization, began requiring all medical practitioners to obtain licenses from government-appointed boards that tested knowledge of classical medical texts. This was presented as a return to scientific medicine, but it was really a return to the same theoretical orthodoxy that had been rejected during the medical revolution. Healers who had spent decades developing practical skills found themselves being examined on their knowledge of Galenic humoral theory by bureaucrats who had never treated a patient in their lives. The final major players in this medical counter-revolution were the emerging universities, which began offering formal medical education based on recovered classical texts and new theological frameworks that integrated Christian doctrine with ancient medical theory. These institutions attracted students by promising professional credentials and social respectability that independent healers couldn't provide. University-trained physicians presented themselves as the legitimate heirs to both classical medical wisdom and Christian moral authority, creating a powerful combination that was difficult for practical healers to compete against. Last attempts to preserve the independent medical tradition took various forms, from underground networks of unlicensed healers to formal appeals for recognition of practical medical knowledge. Some veteran healers tried to adapt by obtaining official credentials while maintaining their practical approaches, but they often found that institutional requirements forced them to abandon the methods that had made them effective in favor of approved procedures that satisfied bureaucratic standards rather than patient needs. The dramatic final moments of the post-classical medical systems were probably less dramatic than they seemed to people living through them. There was no single decisive battle between old and new approaches to medicine, just a gradual process of regulation, co-optation, and institutional pressure that slowly transformed the medical landscape. Independent healers didn't disappear overnight. They were gradually marginalized, regulated out of business, or absorbed into institutional structures that neutralized their independence while preserving their practical knowledge. The symbolic endpoints varied by region and institution, but historians generally mark the transition as complete when the last generation of healers, who had learned their trade during the post-classical period, died off or retired. By the 6th century CE, most medical practice in the former Roman territories was controlled by either monastic institutions or secular authorities that required formal credentials and adherence to approved theoretical frameworks. What made this transformation particularly ironic was that the new institutional medical system retained many of the same problems that had plagued classical medicine: theoretical rigidity, resistance to innovation, and prioritization of professional authority over practical results, while adding new problems like religious orthodoxy and bureaucratic oversight. The medical revolution that had begun with grassroots rejection of ineffective medical authority ended with the restoration of ineffective medical authority under new management. The analysis of why the post-classical medical experiment collapsed reveals fundamental tensions between innovation and stability, individual expertise and institutional authority, and practical results and social control that continue to shape medical practice today. The decline wasn't simply due to external pressure from churches and governments. It reflected internal contradictions within the decentralized medical system that made it vulnerable to institutional takeover. Internal problems included the persistent issue of quality control that had never been adequately resolved. While the post-classical system had successfully eliminated uniformly bad medical practice, it had never developed reliable mechanisms for distinguishing between good and bad practitioners, or for maintaining standards across different regions and communities. This created opportunities for genuinely incompetent or fraudulent healers to exploit the system's openness, undermining public confidence in independent medical practice. The economic sustainability of decentralized medicine was also problematic. Independent healers could provide effective care for common conditions, but they lacked the resources to handle complex medical problems that required expensive equipment, rare medications, or coordinated care from multiple specialists. When patients with serious conditions couldn't get adequate treatment from independent practitioners, they turned to institutions that could provide more comprehensive services, even if those institutions were less effective for routine care. External pressures from rising Christian and secular authorities were certainly significant, but they were effective primarily because they offered solutions to problems that the decentralized system had been unable to solve. Monastic hospitals provided reliable funding, standardized training, and institutional continuity that independent healers couldn't match. Government regulation offered consumer protection and professional accountability that the medical marketplace had failed to provide. The role of historical forces versus individual decisions in the decline is complex and debatable. Some historians argue that the rise of Christianity and the consolidation of post-Roman political authority made institutional control of medicine inevitable, regardless of how well the decentralized system was working. Others contend that different choices by key individuals, particularly influential healers and community leaders, could have preserved medical independence while addressing its structural problems. What could have been done differently is a question that has occupied medical historians for centuries. Some suggest that formal organization of independent healers into professional associations could have provided quality control and political influence without sacrificing innovation and flexibility. Others argued that the integration of practical medical knowledge with formal educational institutions could have preserved the best elements of both systems. The inevitability versus contingency debate reflects broader questions about the relationship between individual agency and social structure. The post-classical medical system faced genuine challenges that required institutional solutions, but the specific form those institutions took, heavily religious, bureaucratic, and theoretically oriented, wasn't necessarily inevitable. Alternative institutional arrangements might have preserved more of the innovation and practical focus that had made the decentralized system effective. Cultural factors also played important roles in the system's decline. The post-classical medical culture had been built around skepticism of authority and confidence in individual judgment, values that were increasingly at odds with Christian emphasis on faith, obedience, and submission to divine authority. As Christian culture became dominant throughout the former Roman Empire, the intellectual foundations of independent medical practice were gradually undermined. The demographic reality was that the generation of healers who had participated in the original medical revolution was aging and dying, while younger practitioners were being trained in institutional settings that emphasized theoretical knowledge and professional credentials over practical experience. This generational transition meant that the knowledge and attitudes that had sustained independent medicine were gradually being lost, even without active suppression by hostile institutions. The immediate aftermath of the post-classical medical system's decline was a period of institutional consolidation that saw the emergence of medieval medical practice as we traditionally understand it, a combination of recovered classical texts, Christian theology, and bureaucratic organization that would dominate European healthcare for the next 1,000 years. But the transition wasn't as clean or complete as institutional authorities wanted people to believe. Who stepped into the vacuum left by independent healers was primarily a combination of monastic institutions and university-trained physicians, but also a shadow network of unlicensed practitioners who continued to provide practical medical care to people who couldn't access or afford institutional services. The official medical establishment claimed to have restored scientific medicine and eliminated quackery, but in reality, they had mainly succeeded in driving practical medical knowledge underground, while institutionalizing theoretical approaches that were often just as ineffective as classical medicine had been. Short-term consequences included a reduction in medical innovation, as institutional control discouraged experimentation and emphasized conformity to approved methods. The quality of routine medical care declined in many areas as practical healers were replaced by theoretically trained practitioners who understood medical texts better than actual patients. However, institutional medicine was more successful at handling complex cases that required coordinated care and expensive resources. Contemporary reactions were mixed and often depended on social class and geographic location. Wealthy urban populations generally welcomed the return of prestigious medical institutions and professionally credentialed physicians. Rural and working-class communities often resented the loss of accessible, affordable healers and the imposition of medical authority that seemed more concerned with religious orthodoxy than practical results. Attempts at revival or continuation of independent medical practice took various forms, from formal appeals for recognition of traditional healing knowledge to underground networks that preserve practical medical techniques outside institutional control. Some regions maintained hybrid systems that combined institutional oversight with practical healing traditions, while others saw the complete suppression of non-institutional medical practice. The most significant immediate legacy was the establishment of patterns of medical authority and institutional control that would shape healthcare for centuries. The idea that legitimate medical practice required formal credentials, Theoretical training and institutional oversight became so deeply embedded in European culture that it survived the eventual recognition that medieval medicine was often ineffective. The post-classical experiment with decentralized, practical medicine was largely forgotten, remembered mainly as a period of chaos and decline rather than as a potentially viable alternative to institutional medical control. The legacy of ancient medical disasters shaped later developments in ways that are both obvious and surprisingly subtle, creating patterns of medical authority, patient skepticism, and institutional behavior that persist in modern healthcare systems. The medieval period inherited not just the specific medical practices of antiquity, but also the fundamental tensions between theoretical knowledge and practical results, professional authority and patient autonomy, and institutional control, and individual innovation that had defined ancient medicine. Medieval medicine retained the worst aspects of ancient medical practice while losing many of the innovations that had emerged during the post-classical period. The monastic hospitals that replaced independent healers preserved Galenic humoral theory and classical surgical techniques, but abandoned the practical, results-oriented approaches that had actually improved patient outcomes. This meant that medieval patients got the theoretical sophistication of ancient medicine without any of the practical wisdom that communities had developed through trial and error. The influence on later generations was profound and largely negative. The institutional medical system that emerged from the collapse of post-classical medicine became the template for European healthcare for nearly 1,000 years. Medical schools based their curricula on recovered classical texts rather than clinical observation, creating generations of physicians who were trained to value theoretical knowledge over practical experience. The idea that medical authority should be based on formal credentials rather than demonstrated results became so deeply embedded in European culture that it survived the eventual recognition that much medieval medicine was ineffective. Specific influences on later medical development included the establishment of licensing systems that prioritized educational credentials over practical competence, the integration of religious and moral authority with medical practice, and the suppression of alternative healing traditions that might have contributed to medical progress. These institutional structures persisted long after the specific medical theories they were designed to support had been abandoned, creating bureaucratic and professional obstacles to medical innovation that continue to influence healthcare today. The myths that developed around ancient medicine were often more influential than the historical realities. Medieval and Renaissance medical authorities created romanticized versions of classical medicine that emphasized its theoretical sophistication while ignoring its practical failures. Galen was remembered as a brilliant medical scientist rather than as someone whose treatments had nearly killed an emperor, and classical medical texts were treated as authoritative sources of medical knowledge rather than as historical documents reflecting the limitations of ancient understanding. Why ancient medicine remained important to later generations had less to do with its actual effectiveness and more to do with its cultural prestige and institutional utility. Classical medical texts provided intellectual legitimacy for medieval physicians who needed to distinguish themselves from folk healers and religious practitioners. The complexity and sophistication of ancient medical theory made it useful for establishing professional authority, even when that theory had little connection to successful medical practice. The persistence of classical medical influence also reflected broader cultural patterns of authority and tradition in medieval and early modern Europe. In societies that valued ancient wisdom over contemporary innovation, medical practices gained credibility through their connection to classical sources rather than through their practical effectiveness. This created a medical culture that was more concerned with preserving traditional knowledge than with developing new understanding, leading to centuries of medical stagnation that might have been avoided if the practical innovations of the post-classical period had been better preserved. Ironically, some of the most important medical advances of the later medieval and Renaissance periods came from practitioners who rediscovered principles that had been developed during the post-classical experiment with practical medicine. Military surgeons, midwives, and folk healers often understood trauma care, wound management, and basic hygiene better than university-trained physicians, because they had maintained practical traditions that had been abandoned by institutional medicine. When formal medical education finally began to emphasize clinical observation and practical training, it was essentially rediscovering approaches that had been successfully employed during the post-classical period. Today, we can see echoes of ancient medical disasters in contemporary healthcare systems that would be depressingly familiar to anyone who survived the Antonine Plague or experienced treatment by Galen. While modern medicine is obviously far more effective than ancient medicine, many of the structural problems that plagued ancient healthcare, perverse economic incentives, institutional resistance to change, and the prioritization of professional authority over patient outcomes, continue to shape medical practice in ways that sometimes undermine the very scientific advances that distinguish modern medicine from its ancient predecessors. The most obvious parallel is in how economic incentives can distort medical practice in ways that harm patients while enriching practitioners. Just as ancient physicians made more money by keeping patients sick longer, modern healthcare systems often reward providers for performing expensive procedures rather than achieving good outcomes. The fee-for-service model that dominates much of American healthcare creates incentives for overtreatment that would have been familiar to Roman patients who were bled, purged, and subjected to unnecessary surgeries by doctors who were paid for each intervention rather than for actually helping people get better. Professional authority continues to create barriers between medical knowledge and practical results in ways that mirror ancient patterns. Modern medical licensing systems, while obviously more rigorous than ancient credentials, can still prioritize formal education over practical competence and create professional monopolies that limit patient choice and innovation. The resistance of medical establishments to alternative or complementary therapies sometimes reflects the same institutional conservatism that led classical physicians to reject practical healing methods that actually worked. What hasn't changed about human nature is the tendency for people to seek medical certainty and miraculous cures, even when realistic options are available. Modern patients still flock to practitioners who promise revolutionary treatments and easy solutions, just as ancient Romans paid premium prices for the Solace's 3-day cure system. The proliferation of medical misinformation on the internet creates opportunities for modern quacks that are remarkably similar to the unregulated medical marketplace of the ancient world, where anyone could claim medical expertise and desperate people were willing to try anything. Similar patterns appear in different contexts throughout modern healthcare. The opioid crisis, for example, reflects the same combination of professional overconfidence, economic incentives, and institutional failure that characterized ancient medicine. Physicians prescribed addictive medications based on theoretical claims about their safety and effectiveness. Pharmaceutical companies promoted treatments that enriched them while harming patients. And regulatory institutions failed to protect the public from medical practices that were obviously causing more harm than good. The tendency for successful medical innovations to become corrupted by commercial and professional interests also continues in modern healthcare. Just as effective folk remedies were often transformed into expensive, elaborate treatments that destroyed their original effectiveness, promising medical technologies are sometimes developed in ways that prioritize profitability over patient benefit. The integration of artificial intelligence into medical diagnosis, for example, could either democratize medical knowledge or create new forms of expensive, technological dependency that replicate ancient patterns of medical authority. Institutional medicine's resistance to change remains as problematic today as it was in ancient times. Medical schools still emphasize theoretical knowledge over practical skills in ways that can leave new physicians unprepared for actual patient care. Professional associations sometimes resist innovations that threaten established practice patterns, even when those innovations could improve patient outcomes. The hierarchical structure of modern hospitals can create communication barriers that prevent important medical information from reaching decision-makers, just as ancient medical hierarchies prevented practical knowledge from influencing theoretical medicine. Perhaps most importantly, modern healthcare still struggles with the fundamental tension between individual patient needs and systematic approaches to medical care. Evidence-based medicine, while obviously superior to ancient medical theory, can sometimes create protocols and guidelines that don't account for individual variation and clinical judgment. The pressure to standardize medical practice, while generally beneficial, can also discourage the kind of individualized, adaptive approaches that made some ancient healers effective despite their limited knowledge. The lesson for contemporary issues is that technical medical knowledge, while necessary, isn't sufficient to create effective healthcare systems. The structural and institutional problems that plague ancient medicine, perverse incentives, professional self-interest, and resistance to change, require ongoing attention and reform efforts that go beyond simply advancing medical science. Even now, ancient medical disasters continue to influence modern healthcare in ways that are often invisible but occasionally dramatic. Academic medicine still bears the institutional DNA of medieval medical schools that were designed to preserve classical medical knowledge rather than to generate new understanding. The emphasis on theoretical mastery over practical competence that characterized ancient medical education persists in medical schools that require students to memorize vast amounts of information while providing limited hands-on clinical experience. Medical research continues to be influenced by ancient assumptions about the relationship between theory and practice. The hierarchy that places laboratory research above clinical observation and clinical observation above patient experience reflects the same intellectual prejudices that led ancient physicians to trust classical texts more than their own eyes. While modern medical research is obviously far more sophisticated than ancient medical theory, the institutional structures that determine research priorities and funding still sometimes prioritize theoretical elegance over practical utility. The persistence of ancient medical influence is particularly visible in how medical professionals relate to patients and to each other. The paternalistic attitudes that many physicians display toward patients, the assumption that medical professionals know what's best for patients better than patients themselves, directly reflects ancient medical traditions that viewed patients as passive recipients of expert care rather than as active participants in their own healing. The resistance of some medical professionals to patient advocacy and shared decision-making echoes ancient medical culture that saw patient questioning of medical authority as ignorant and dangerous. Popular culture representations of medicine continue to reflect ancient mythologies about medical practice that often bear little resemblance to actual healthcare. Television medical dramas that portray physicians as heroic figures who save lives through dramatic interventions perpetuate the same myths about medical authority and effectiveness that made ancient quacks successful. The popular image of medicine as a field where brilliant individuals use advanced knowledge to work miraculous cures is essentially a modern version of ancient beliefs about medical expertise. Political discourse about healthcare is also influenced by ancient medical assumptions, particularly the idea that more medical intervention is always better than less intervention, and that expensive, Technologically sophisticated treatments are inherently superior to simple, affordable ones. Healthcare policy debates often reflect the same tensions between institutional medical authority and individual choice that characterized ancient medical culture. Perhaps most significantly, ancient medical disasters continue to influence modern healthcare through the persistence of institutional structures and professional attitudes that prioritize system maintenance over patient care. The bureaucratic complexity of modern healthcare, while serving some legitimate purposes, also creates barriers to innovation and patient access that would have been familiar to people who lived through the transition from practical post-classical medicine to institutional medieval medicine. The study of ancient medicine remains relevant not because ancient medical practices were effective, but because the problems that made ancient medicine ineffective, institutional resistance to change, economic incentives that conflict with patient welfare, and professional cultures that value authority over results are still present in modern healthcare systems that could benefit from the same kind of critical examination that led to the ancient medical revolution. The enduring fascination with ancient medical disasters reflects deeper anxieties about modern healthcare that go beyond simple historical curiosity. When people learn about Galen nearly killing Emperor Marcus Aurelius with bloodletting and purging, they're not just laughing at ancient ignorance. They're recognizing patterns of medical overconfidence and institutional failure that feel uncomfortably familiar in contemporary healthcare settings. Academic study of ancient medicine has intensified in recent decades as medical historians have recognized that understanding the structural problems of ancient healthcare can illuminate similar issues in modern medical systems. Medical schools now include more history of medicine in their curricula, not just to provide cultural context, but to help future physicians recognize how professional bias, economic incentives, and institutional pressures can distort medical judgment in ways that harm patients. The relevance to political discourse is particularly significant in an era of healthcare reform and debate about medical authority. Conservative critics of government healthcare programs often point to ancient examples of institutional medical failure to argue against centralized medical authority, while progressive advocates for healthcare reform use ancient examples of medical inequality and commercialization to support arguments for more equitable and accountable healthcare systems. Social movements continue to draw lessons from ancient medical history, particularly the post-classical period's experiment with decentralized, practical medicine. Patient advocacy groups use historical examples of successful resistance to medical authority to support contemporary arguments for patient rights and shared decision-making. Alternative medicine advocates point to the suppression of practical healing traditions during the transition to institutional medieval medicine as a cautionary tale about the dangers of medical orthodoxy. The influence on modern medical ethics is particularly profound. Bioethics courses routinely use ancient medical cases to illustrate principles of informed consent, patient autonomy, and professional responsibility. The ancient medical disasters provide clear examples of what happens when medical professionals prioritize their own interests over patient welfare, making them useful teaching tools for discussing contemporary ethical dilemmas. Public health policy is also influenced by ancient medical history, particularly in discussions about the regulation of medical practice and the balance between professional autonomy and public protection. The ancient experience with unregulated medical markets provides evidence for both sides of contemporary debates about medical licensing, alternative therapies, and consumer protection in healthcare. Perhaps most importantly, ancient medical history continues to influence how ordinary people think about their relationship with healthcare systems and medical professionals. The knowledge that patients throughout history have had to navigate medical systems that were often more interested in professional authority than patient welfare helps contemporary patients feel more confident about questioning medical advice. seeking second opinions, and taking active roles in their own healthcare decisions. The persistence of public interest in ancient medical disasters suggests that these stories serve an important psychological function, helping people process their own anxieties about modern medicine by placing contemporary healthcare problems in historical context. Understanding that medical systems have always been imperfect and that patients have always had to be advocates for their own health can be both sobering and empowering for people facing their own medical challenges. Looking back across the centuries of ancient medical disasters we've explored together, we've seen a remarkable parade of human ingenuity applied to the art of making people sicker while charging them money for the privilege. From the snake-infested temples of Asclepius to the organized incompetence of Roman military hospitals, from the chaotic marketplace of civilian quackery to the institutional restoration of theoretical medicine, ancient healthcare was a masterclass in how intelligent, well-meaning people could create systems that were spectacularly counterproductive. The key patterns that emerged throughout our journey reveal uncomfortable truths about the relationship between knowledge and authority, good intentions and harmful outcomes, and individual competence and institutional power. We saw how Roman military medicine could be simultaneously advanced and deadly, how civilian medical chaos could produce both genuine innovation and spectacular fraud, and how institutional reform could restore order while eliminating effectiveness. Most surprising among our discoveries was probably the realization that the ancient world's brief experiment with decentralized, practical medicine actually worked better than either the classical medical system that preceded it or the institutional system that replaced it. The post-classical period, usually dismissed by historians as a time of medical decline, turns out to have been an accidental golden age of pragmatic healthcare that was destroyed not by ignorance, but by the restoration of professional medical authority. The most important takeaways from our journey through ancient medical disasters are both historical and contemporary. Historically, we've learned that medical progress isn't always linear. Sometimes societies stumble onto effective approaches that are later abandoned in favor of more prestigious but less effective alternatives. The ancient world's experience demonstrates that institutional medical authority and actual medical effectiveness are not the same thing, and that patients throughout history have had to navigate healthcare systems that were often more concerned with professional interests than patient welfare. Perhaps most importantly, we've seen how economic incentives, social pressures, and institutional dynamics can corrupt even well-intentioned medical practice in ways that persist across centuries and cultures. The problems that made ancient medicine dangerous: overconfidence, economic conflicts of interest, resistance to evidence that contradicted established practices, are not simply artifacts of ancient ignorance, but reflect deeper structural challenges that any medical system must address. How our understanding has evolved throughout this exploration reflects the complexity of evaluating medical systems across different time periods and cultural contexts. What initially appeared to be a straightforward story of progress from ignorance to knowledge turns out to be a more complicated narrative about the tension between systematic approaches and practical results, professional authority and patient autonomy, and institutional stability and medical innovation. The ancient medical experience offers both cautionary tales and reasons for optimism about modern healthcare. While contemporary medicine is obviously far more effective than ancient medicine, the persistence of structural problems suggests that continued vigilance and reform efforts are necessary to prevent modern healthcare from developing the same pathologies that plague ancient medical systems. The ancient world's occasional successes with practical, patient-centered approaches demonstrate that effective healthcare is possible, even without perfect medical knowledge, as long as the incentives and institutional structures support patient welfare over professional interests. Let me leave you with one final story that encapsulates everything we've learned about ancient medicine and its continuing relevance to our own time. In the late 5th century CE, during the final transition from practical to institutional medicine, there lived a woman named Julia Fortunata in what is now southern France. Julia wasn't a trained physician, a temple priestess, or a monastic healer. She was a baker's widow who had learned practical medicine through necessity when her husband died and left her responsible for caring for their 6 children and elderly neighbors in a small rural community. Julia's approach to medicine was revolutionary. In its simplicity, she listened to patients, observed what treatments worked, and abandoned methods that didn't help people get better. When children in her community developed fevers, she didn't bleed them or purge them or consult astrological charts. She kept them cool, gave them water, and waited to see if their bodies could fight off whatever was making them sick. When women had difficult childbirths, she didn't perform elaborate rituals or invoke divine intervention. She drew on practical knowledge passed down from other women and focused on keeping mothers and babies safe rather than following prescribed procedures. What made Julia remarkable wasn't her medical knowledge, which was limited by ancient standards, but her approach to using that knowledge. She kept careful mental records of what treatments worked for which conditions. She asked other healers about their methods and adopted techniques that seemed effective. And she was honest with patients about what she could and couldn't do. When someone had a condition she couldn't treat, she didn't invent elaborate explanations or prescribe expensive remedies. She admitted her limitations and helped families care for their sick relatives as comfortably as possible. Julia's practice attracted attention from both traveling physicians and local church authorities, who were suspicious of unlicensed medical practice and concerned about a woman providing healthcare without proper theological supervision. The physicians complained that she was practicing medicine without training in classical medical theory, while the church authorities worried that she was treating illness without addressing its spiritual causes. Both groups agreed that Julia's approach was dangerously simplistic and potentially harmful to people who needed proper professional care. The irony, of course, was that Julia's patients were generally healthier than people who received professional medical treatment. Children treated by Julia for common childhood illnesses had lower mortality rates than children treated by licensed physicians. Women who received childbirth assistance from Julia were less likely to die from complications than women who were attended by professionally trained practitioners. Even complex conditions seemed to respond better to Julia's conservative, supportive care than to the aggressive interventions favored by institutional medicine. Julia's story ended in 487 CE when local church authorities, with support from visiting physicians, banned her from practicing medicine without proper credentials and theological supervision. She was given the choice of submitting to formal medical and religious training or abandoning her healing practice entirely. Julia chose to stop practicing medicine rather than submit to institutional control, and she returned to baking bread for her community. The patients who had relied on Julia's care were forced to seek treatment from licensed practitioners who charged higher fees, required religious consultation, and used methods that Julia's former patients knew from experience were less effective than her simple, practical approach. Some families continued to seek Julia's advice informally, but she could no longer provide the systematic health care that had made her community healthier and more resilient. Why this story encapsulates the broader themes of ancient medicine is that it reveals how medical effectiveness and medical authority are often inversely related, how institutional solutions to medical problems can destroy the very qualities that make healthcare effective, and how the transition from practical to theoretical medicine often harmed the very people it was supposed to help. Julia Fortunata's story reminds us that effective healthcare has always been more about human wisdom, careful observation, and genuine concern for patient welfare than about theoretical sophistication or institutional authority. The ancient world's medical disasters were ultimately failures of humanity rather than failures of knowledge. They occurred when healers forgot that their primary responsibility was to help people rather than to demonstrate their expertise, maintain their authority, or preserve their institutions. As we face our own healthcare challenges in the modern world, the lessons of ancient medicine remain relevant and sobering. The technical capabilities of contemporary medicine are vastly superior to anything available in the ancient world. But the human and institutional factors that made ancient medicine dangerous, professional overconfidence, economic conflicts of interest, resistance to evidence, continue to influence healthcare in ways that can undermine even the most advanced medical science. Perhaps the most important lesson from our journey through ancient medical disasters is that good healthcare requires not just medical knowledge, but also humility, honesty, and institutional structures that prioritize patient welfare over professional interests. The ancient world occasionally achieved this balance, usually by accident, and when they did, people were healthier and happier despite having access to primitive medical technology. Tonight, as we reach the end of our exploration through the wonderfully chaotic world of ancient healthcare, I hope you found some comfort in knowing that humans have always been remarkably creative in their approaches to healing, even when those approaches were spectacularly misguided. There's something oddly reassuring about discovering that our ancestors faced many of the same healthcare challenges we do today, and that they muddled through with a combination of practical wisdom, stubborn determination, and occasional accidental insight. The ancient world's medical disasters weren't just historical curiosities. They were genuine, human dramas involving real people who were trying to help each other in the face of illness, injury, and uncertainty. While we can laugh at the obvious mistakes and absurd theories, it's worth remembering that behind every medical disaster was someone's genuine attempt to reduce suffering and restore health. Even when their methods were counterproductive. Form use ancient examples of medical inequality and commercialization to support arguments for more equitable and accountable healthcare systems. Social movements continue to draw lessons from ancient medical history, particularly the post-classical period's experiment with decentralized practical medicine. Patient advocacy groups use historical examples of successful resistance to medical authority to support contemporary arguments for patient rights and shared decision-making. Alternative medicine advocates point to the suppression of practical healing traditions during the transition to institutional medieval medicine as a cautionary tale about the dangers of medical orthodoxy. The influence on modern medical ethics is particularly profound. Bioethics courses routinely use ancient medical cases to illustrate principles of informed consent, patient autonomy, and professional responsibility. The ancient medical disasters provide clear examples of what happens when medical professionals prioritize their own interests over patient welfare, making them useful teaching tools for discussing contemporary ethical dilemmas. Public health policy is also influenced by ancient medical history, particularly in discussions about the regulation of medical practice and the balance between professional autonomy and public protection. The ancient experience with unregulated medical markets provides evidence for both sides of contemporary debates about medical licensing, alternative therapies, and consumer protection in healthcare. Perhaps most importantly, ancient medical history continues to influence how ordinary people think about their relationship with healthcare systems and medical professionals. The knowledge that patients throughout history have had to navigate medical systems that were often more interested in professional authority than patient welfare helps contemporary patients feel more confident about questioning medical advice, seeking second opinions, and taking active roles in their own healthcare decisions. The persistence of public interest in ancient medical disasters suggests that these stories serve an important psychological function, helping people process their own anxieties about modern medicine by placing contemporary healthcare problems in historical context. Understanding that medical systems have always been imperfect and that patients have always had to be advocates for their own health can be both sobering and empowering for people facing their own medical challenges. Looking back across the centuries of ancient medical disasters we've explored together, we've seen a remarkable parade of human ingenuity applied to the art of making people sicker while charging them money for the privilege. From the snake-infested temples of Asclepius to the organized incompetence of Roman military hospitals, from the chaotic marketplace of civilian quackery to the institutional restoration of theoretical medicine, ancient healthcare was a masterclass in how intelligent, well-meaning people could create systems that were spectacularly counterproductive. What I find most moving about the ancient medical experience is not the spectacular failures or occasional successes, but the persistence of human hope and care in the face of uncertainty. Whether they were Roman soldiers submitting to military Medici, desperate families seeking divine intervention at healing temples, or communities experimenting with practical alternatives to professional medicine, ancient people never stopped trying to take care of each other, even when they didn't really understand what they were doing. The story of ancient medicine is ultimately a story about human resilience and the enduring desire to heal and be healed. While the specific methods have changed dramatically, the fundamental human experiences of illness, recovery, and caring for others remain remarkably constant across centuries and cultures. Ancient medical disasters remind us that healthcare is always a human endeavor, dependent on individual wisdom and institutional choices rather than just technical knowledge. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you can take some satisfaction in knowing that whatever healthcare challenges you might face, you are living in an era when medical treatment is far more likely to help than to harm you, a privilege that most humans throughout history could never take for granted. Sweet dreams, and here's to hoping that future generations will look back on our own medical practices with the same mixture of horror, amusement, and appreciation for human effort that we've brought to examining the medical adventures of the ancient world. I want to thank you for joining me on this journey through the fascinating and terrifying world of ancient healthcare. Exploring history together like this, diving deep into the human stories behind historical events, is one of my favorite things to do. And I hope you've enjoyed discovering how much our ancestors' experiences continue to resonate with our own lives. If tonight's exploration has sparked your curiosity about other aspects of ancient life, or if you have thoughts about connections between ancient and modern healthcare, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. History is most meaningful when it helps us understand our present circumstances better, and your perspectives on how these ancient medical disasters connect to contemporary healthcare challenges could enrich everyone's understanding. The ancient world was full of people trying to solve problems with limited knowledge and imperfect institutions, much like we are today. By understanding their struggles, mistakes, and occasional successes, we can perhaps make better choices in our own time. Thank you for spending this time with me exploring the endlessly fascinating complexity of human attempts to heal and be healed. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other, and maybe appreciate your next doctor's visit just a little bit more.